the first trip we did was in 2014. So we did both Georgia and Armenia. That's fairly typical of these kinds of tours. Most people either go to Georgia and Armenia and potentially Azerbaijan or some combination thereof. And so one of the things that we did was we went on this particular tour, it was slightly longer. We went to Svaneti, which we'll be talking about at the end of this talk, and saw these absolutely insane tower houses. And I can assure you, when you look at this picture, you're like, is it really that picturesque? And yes, it really, truly is. So absolutely amazing. Any of you who've ever seen any fantasy films like Lord of the Rings, when you actually go here, you see all these fantastic buildings. It's an amazing place. So we did that in 2014. And then in 2015, we went again, this time slightly shorter. So we didn't go to Svaneti because it's a very, very long way to get there. You actually have to drive for various complicated reasons. And so we spent sort of equal time in both Georgia and Armenia. So this picture is from Armenia. So this is Garni. So we'll not be talking about this time. But anyway, it gives you a sense of some of the sites to see in both of these regions. So really a fantastic experience. We were very lucky as well. The OI had some wonderful local guides they were able to bring in. So we were really fortunate. And indeed, in the second trip, we actually did wine tasting in Georgia. So that was a lot of fun. We'll be talking about wine in Georgia shortly. Right. So you may say, what is Georgia? Because of course, normally when you talk to people and you say, well, I'm going to Georgia, their response is the state. But of course, no, this is not the US state of Georgia. This is the Republic of Georgia. So of course, Georgia is located in the South Caucasus, as you can see here, bordered to the south by Turkey, Armenia, and then to the south and to the east by Azerbaijan, and then to the north by the Russian Federation. So a former Soviet republic that then became, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, independent. And this is one of the reasons why people tended not to visit Georgia prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union, just because it was more complicated. As those of you who had traveled to the Soviet Union will know, it was more complicated to go there. And even in the 19th century, Georgia was quite inaccessible for sort of Western European and North American travelers, because normally you actually had to travel through Russia to get there. So it was actually a very long trip. So Georgia's sort of been for a long time a place which is not been as accessible, but with cheap flights, at least up until this past year, more and more people are starting to discover Georgia and realize that Georgia has all of these really special things. We actually did an article in News and Notes a couple of years ago on Georgia, sort of highlighting some of the special things about Georgia, which we'll talk about. So what we're going to be doing today is really talking about sort of some of the sites that we saw when we went to Georgia on the various trips, as well as some of the cultural background, and of course, the wine, which we have to talk about. Right. So one of the first things to keep in mind is that Georgia is not Georgia. So the Georgians themselves do not refer to Georgia as Georgia. They refer to it as Sakartvelo. There's a number of theories about how we in the West started to refer to this as Georgia rather than Sakartvelo. And so one of the theories is, and of course, as usual, no one can agree, but one of the theories is that the term Georgia comes from the Persian Gorgon, coming from the Middle Persian Vergon or Gorgon, from the Old Persian Varkana, or the very evocative land of wolves. And you can see here this map by Pietro Visconti from 1320. This is the first mention of Georgia on a map. So we actually have, Georgia is, as I say, it's not the term that they themselves use for their own country. I mean, obviously they do when they're talking about it in English, because they understand that if they said Sakartvelo, no one would know what they meant. Now, the theory then becomes that Jacques de Vitry, the 13th century bishop of Acre, decided that the term actually had to do with the fact that the Georgians, as he said, these men are called Georgians because they especially revere and worship Saint George, whom they make their patron and standard bearer in their fight with the infidels, and they honor him above all other saints. So this was the theory, that the reason it's called this is, because basically the idea was this sort of Gurgon became, transmogrified into something that sounded like Georgia. And to explain this, they're like, well, it's because they worship St. George. And indeed, St. George is an incredibly important saint in Georgia. So this is, yeah, so basically it gets into, Western literature and becomes Georgia. And of course, people like Jacques de Vitry then had to explain sort of the reasons behind why this name was. Now, the other thing that makes Georgia unique is indeed the Georgian language. So the Georgian language belongs to the Kartvelian language family. This language family includes not just Georgian, but also Mingrelian and Laz and Svan. These languages are not related, despite people's best efforts, to any other languages. Now, people have tried to link Georgian to things like Sumerian and Basque, but yeah, nobody succeeded. So basically, this is a language isolate family. And that means then that when you start looking at the language, it doesn't act like other languages in some ways, or the vocabulary is very different. And we'll get to why that is in a second. So you've probably been seeing already on these slides another alphabet, and that kind of looks very sort of curvy and cursive-y. And this is the Georgian alphabet that is currently being used. And you can see it here, basically, all these lovely letters. And speaking as somebody who I was fortunate enough to take Georgian for 3 years at the University of Chicago with Tammy Wysocki Nimi, it is, yeah, it's a beautiful language to write, actually. It's one of these ones that, and I have terrible handwriting, but it's one of these ones that really lends itself to a very cursive, very beautiful script. Some people say it's supposed to look like a vine, a grapevine. Maybe, but as you can see, it is extremely, it is really nice. So as in terms of the alphabet, it's a lot of fun to write. Now, you notice that I said the current alphabet. Now, Georgian, because of course Georgian is a unique language family. It also is unique in terms of the fact that there's been multiple alphabets. And you can see the comparison. So the modern one is in the third line going across. And then you can see the other alphabets. So the oldest alphabet is Anasomatavrouli, which is used first attested around the 5th century and ends in general use around the 9th century CE. It's replaced by Nushkuri, which is used primarily between the 9th and the 11th centuries, and then Mehraduli, which is the last alphabet, the current one, which is used basically from the 10th century onwards, although certain parts of these alphabets are used in liturgical manuscripts, religious manuscripts, this kind of thing. So, and you also have sometimes manuscripts where they use multiple alphabets in the same manuscript, just to make it exciting. And as you can see, you can't necessarily read one and be able to read the other one. I mean, some of the letters do look similar, but I can assure you, having tried to read some of the old Georgian inscriptions on buildings with only having the knowledge of the modern script, that you are not helped entirely. So it's one of these things that obviously is a specialization that you need to sort of develop. And just to give you an example of some of the complexities of the Georgian language, words do things you don't expect, as does the grammar. This is probably the most complicated grammatical language I have ever learned. It's a lot of fun to learn. I don't want to give anybody the idea that it's not, but it is hard. So just to give you a sense of this, mama. Now, in pretty much every language, mama or that word or something very similar means mother, right? Well, not in Georgian. It means father. And mother is dada. So, which of course sounds an awful lot like dada, right? So this gives you, I think, a sense of how complicated this language is without spending the rest of this time talking about this language, which I could do, but obviously we want to look at the area itself. So one of the things to keep in mind is Georgia is very unique, right? So it has a unique alphabet, it has a unique language, which operates in a unique way. And you can see here the spread of the Kartvelian language family. So mostly confined to Georgia itself. You can see Svan is up in Svaneti, which we'll be talking about, Mingrelian on the coast. And then we also have Laz, which is actually spoken in Turkey. So there is some Kartvelian language spoken in Turkey with Laz, but otherwise it's basically confined to Georgia. Right, so wine. Georgia is very famous for its wine. And increasingly people in the United States and elsewhere are outside of the former Soviet republics are discovering this and discovering the complexities and the interest of Georgian wine. Now, Georgian wine is, as you can see, these are we'll talk about this in a little bit, but these are actually the qvevri, or where they actually put the wine in when they ferment it. So, and a lot of these are associated indeed with churches, as you can see here. Right, so don't worry about this list, but there's over 500 Georgian grape varietals. So there's a huge number of Georgian grape varietals, about 40 of which are grown commercially. So a lot of these are not, as I say, not commercial grapes that are grown. For example, if any of you have a Georgian red wine, it might be a Saperavi, because that's a very common Georgian red grape sort. And with the white wines, Mitsvani and Rakatsiteli are also very common types. So there's a huge number of Georgian wines, a sort of dizzying array of unique Georgian wine sorts. And so this is really one of the things that we wanted to do with this particular talk, particularly in the winter and the sort of holiday season, was highlighting Georgian wines. And I know that Matt sent around a link where you could actually buy these if you want to try them for yourself, which I highly recommend. Georgian wine I very much like, and it's really unique and interesting and not the usual thing that you get. Right. So in terms of where Georgian wine is grown, you can see basically pretty much going along the coast and then through sort of the middle of the country and then going through the east. So pretty much Georgian wine is not grown in certain areas, which are of course too mountainous or too high up to grow wine sorts. But you can see quite a bit of the country is given over to actual Georgian wine growing. And you can see these are the various regions with the different types of wine. Kakheti, which we'll be talking about in detail now, is where most of Georgian wine is grown. Almost 3/4 of Georgian wine is grown in Kakheti. And that's indeed where the wine that I have tonight is actually from. But you can see this sort of dizzying array of all kinds of wine sorts, which, yeah, I mean, I myself am not familiar with all of them either. I mean, there's just so many of them. And these are, of course, just the most common ones. So this gives you a sense of the sort of complexities of the Georgian wine culture. Right, so if we turn to Kakheti, to the province of Kakheti, and we turn to where sort of a lot of the wine is grown, which is the Alizani River Valley. So you can see the Alizani River Valley running through here. And the wine I'm going to be talking about basically is a Rakatsiteli wine, which is from the Jotashvili family here. We'll see a close-up of this in a bit. And this actually comes from this area here in Kakheti. And Georgia is very famous not only because it has a lot of wine varietals, but also because the world's oldest wine was actually found there. So Steve Baniuk of the University of Toronto is involved with excavations that got a Trili Gora, and they found wine dating back to 6000 BCE. And indeed, if you go on the OI's YouTube page, you can actually find a lecture by Steve about this important discovery. So he came, I believe it was 2 years ago now, and gave a lecture on sort of the oldest wine that's been found. So it's perhaps not surprising that there's over 500 wine sorts in Georgia, when in fact wine seems to, as far as we can tell, originate in Georgia. So here's the qvevri. So these are these giant jars which are filled with wine, and basically they're buried in the ground. You can see that here, and they're given time to ferment. And this is a famous picture. You'll see this reproduced on a lot of websites. So these are quite big jars, as you can see. So quite a lot of wine going into them. And when we were in Georgia, we visited the site of Baganeti, which is a 4th, 3rd century BCE to 6th century CE site, which has some of the oldest preserved wine cellars. So you can see this seems to be a practice which has a long tradition. Right. So the wines that I'm talking about here, which is this Rakatsiteli, is what's called orange or amber wine. or in Georgian Carvis peri vino. And you can see here, it almost looks like apple juice, right? So this is basically what this is Riccazzatelli is a white grape sort. And normally when you make white grapes, you crush the grapes and then you remove the skins as soon as possible and put them in the vat, or in this case, the jar in which you're fermenting them. But in the case of this kind of amber wine, what you're actually doing is you're putting it in the vat with the skins and the pips. And as a result of natural pigmentation in the skin, it actually turns it orange. So some people actually decant it. So almost like, you know, what you would more expect with a red wine. That's a Mitzvane. And it's really gives it a really unique flavor. So for all of you who have wine with you, so Gau Marjos, which is cheers, or the equivalent thereof in Georgian. Right. So now that we've sort of talked about some of the unique aspects of Georgian culture in general, I want to zoom in on some of the sites that we had the very fortunate opportunity to visit in 2014 and 2015. And the first site I wanted to talk about, because we're going to go sort of more or less in chronological order, is the site of Dmanisi. Now, Dmanisi, as you can see here, is in the south of Georgia, and it's on a trade route. So coming up from Armenia, basically, it's on an important trade route that's going between Armenia and Georgia. Now, looking at this picture, you see this beautiful area with all these lovely trees, very green landscape. You can see a church, you can see a fortress. And so you might think that I'm going to be talking about the medieval period, but that's later. I'm actually going to be talking about the oldest finds of hominins, so not modern man, but actual hominins that we have outside of Africa. So this is the earliest attestation at the site of Dmanisi. They discovered, Georgian archaeologists found skulls and also other bones of what is, well, we're not entirely sure what they are. So there's some idea that these are Homo erectus, but as we'll see shortly, they're not really developed Homo erectus. So they're a little short and a bit not quite as far along, it would appear. So some people say maybe they're Homo habilis rather than early Homo erectus. We're not really sure, but in any case, they're the earliest hominins that are found outside of the African continent, which of course makes them extremely important and leads to questions about what are they doing in Georgia, and of course leads to questions about the diffusion of people and how we got to where we are. So this is an incredibly important find, and you can see the skulls in Tbilisi, so the capital of Georgia, in their museum. And at the site, you also have a sort of, little open air area where you can walk around and see the site of the excavations, which is really cool to do, to actually walk around and think about the fact that, this material dates back as far as 1.8 million years ago, which is obviously a very long time. So basically what happened was people came out of Africa and they diffused into this area of Georgia. And then basically the idea was, for a long time, people thought that they had then moved sort of eastwards, but recent finds of tools dating to 2.5 million years ago in Georgia and over 2 million years ago in China suggests that maybe this diffusion is a little more complex than we thought. Now, just to give us a sense of what Dmanisi man looks like, so you can see he's here. Basically a lot shorter than we are, but also, as you can see with the Homo erectus, he's very much shorter than what we think of as a normal Homo erectus, which is why people have suggested that it may be that this person is actually or individual are, perhaps not actual Homo erectus as we would think of them. Now, it's also the case, and this is perhaps no surprise, that the humans were not the apex predator in this region. So we have numerous finds, as well as puncture marks found on one of the skulls, which leads us to know that, in fact, the Dmanisi individuals were not just doing things with stone tools, which we have, and, hunting and skinning animals. They were also lunch, and specifically lunch for the Meganterions or the saber-toothed tigers, which we find both the skulls as well as puncture marks, which you can see here in this very evocative drawing, where basically the saber-toothed tiger goes wham and crushes and basically, takes out the human and presumably drags them off to eat the rest of them that we don't have. And so that's really sort of interesting that, we have such early examples of, of occupation in Georgia. So again, sort of pointing to the uniqueness of this area. Now, another thing that people tend to think of when they think of Georgia is Colchis. Now, Colchis, as you can see here, is basically we're jumping a long way. We're jumping to the first millennium BCE. So basically, Colchis is an area which is basically, as you can see here, this is showing it between 600 and 150 BCE. And this is a region that the Greeks started to discover and started to found, at least according to Greek sources, and archaeologists who study the region, they started to found colonies along this area for trade. The Black Sea region was very rich in grain, so there was a lot of grain that was being used. People tend to think of Egypt as being the sort of the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, but in fact, the Black Sea played a huge role in the supply of grain to places like Greece and later Rome. And so as a result, the Greeks started settling in this area and started to try and make sense of what they were looking at. So for example, Herodotus actually tries to connect the inhabitants of Colchis to the ancient Egyptians. So he says, "For it is plain to see that the Colchians are Egyptians, and what I say, I myself noted before I heard it from others. When it occurred to me, I inquired of both peoples, and the Colchians remembered the Egyptians better than the Egyptians remembered the Colchians. The Egyptians said they considered the Colchians part of Sesostris' army. I myself guessed it." And then he goes on to talk about this in more detail. So already the Greeks are sort of trying to figure out, who are these people that they're coming into contact with? We've already heard about the sort of unique language and the unique culture of this region. And so the Greeks are now trying to sort of make connections with places that they've heard of, regions that they've actually visited. But of course, most famously in this period is, of course, the story of Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece, because that's where the Golden Fleece is. It's in Colchis. That's where the ship Argo goes. That's where Jason and the Argonauts show up. Medea is the daughter of the king. And of course, this is a very popular story, which appears in multiple different versions. We don't have all the surviving versions. And of course is, very much something that is popular to this day, and is one of the reasons, in fact, why a lot of people got interested in studying Georgia, particularly in the 19th century, and went there with the view of trying to see if they could prove that the legend of the Golden Fleece was true, right? And indeed, there does seem to be some indications that this region is very rich in gold, hence the idea of the Golden Fleece, but yeah, we don't have a golden fleece. Alas, there's no ancient golden fleece, so we can't sort of trace it back that. But in any case, we do know that this was a very rich region. There was a lot of metals there. Grain was grown in this area. And so this is why people went there. So the site of Vani we went to in the first trip. So it's south of Kutaisi. And the site of Vani is probably best known for those of you who may have gone to the ISAW exhibition, and I believe it was either 2007 or 2008, or the more recent Cambridge exhibition. You will know that the site of Vani is considered very famous because of all of the super fantastic gold that showed up in the tombs. So this is just a small sample. So if you go to the Georgia National Museum, you'll actually find that you go into the basement and you go down there, and there's just this massive array of gold. And some of this they sent abroad for exhibitions. And it's just really very impressive if you're sort of into this kind of thing. So this is sort of giving an indication of the wealth sort of this region as you get towards the end of the first millennium BCE. And specifically, as I say, they discovered different graves. And this is a grave of a young woman. There's also a horse and retainers who got to come along. And that basically you can see all of the different kinds of things that showed up in the grave. So not just gold, and you can see these wild boar finials on the edge of these bracelets, some amazing earrings, some silver, very Greek looking metalwork, etc. So showing a lot of connection with Greece. There's also things that show more connections with Persia. But anyway, it shows that this region was very cosmopolitan, was very much interacting with a lot of areas in the first millennium BCE. And specifically, we do have some indication of Greek speakers probably in this region. So from the site of Phasis, which is a Greek, known as being a Greek colony, there was a silver sort of dish that was found. And this silver dish was made in the 5th century BCE, and it was actually found in the North Caucasus, so in the Kuban area. And it showed a 1st century BCE burial mound. Basically, this burial mound yielded this, bowl, and on it, it said in Greek, "I belong to Apollo the hegemon in Phasis," which people have interpreted as being a temple of Apollo in Phasis, which we don't have. But in any case, gives us an idea about the sort of engagement that the Greeks had in this region. Now, you might have gotten the idea from all the gold and all these things. Okay, people thought this was a great place. Well, actually, they didn't necessarily. So on Ayer's waters and places from the 5th century BCE that's attributed to Hippocrates, he says, now let me turn to the dwellers on the Phasis. So this is a river here, which the which the colony is associated with. Their land is marshy, hot, wet, and wooded. Copious violent rains fall there during every season. The waters which drink are hot and stagnant, putrefied by the sun and swollen by the rains. The Phasis itself is the most stagnant and most sluggish of all rivers. The fruits that grow in this country are all stunted, flabby, and imperfect, owing to the excess of water. So you get the sense that maybe some people didn't really enjoy their time that they were spending in Colchis while they were busy colonizing it. So as we move forward with Georgia, one of the major things that happens, and has implications to this day, is the conversion of Georgia to Christianity sometime in the early 4th century CE. Now, Georgia is not really unified. It's ruled by a variety of different sort of little kingdoms. The Romans are here doing things on the western coast. They actually have, there's actually the Roman army shows up and things like this. So it becomes very much part of this struggle between Rome and Persia, much as like Armenia does in the 1st century CE. Now, and you actually have members of first the Parthian and then the Sasanian royal family ruling Georgia, just as they do in Armenia. Now, in the 4th century CE, the king of Georgia basically converts. We don't know exactly when, but anyway, he converts to Christianity, and Georgia is to this day largely Christian country. Now, there are some Muslims there, but primarily Georgia is Christian. So like Armenia, it still remains Christian, unlike the rest of its neighbors. To the south, obviously to the north, Russia is Christian, but to the south, obviously you have Turkey, and Azerbaijan, both of which are Muslim. So it's unique in that sense. And this is interesting because the Muslims actually do conquer Georgia, or at least most of it. So in the middle of the 7th century CE, as we know, basically with the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Empire essentially fighting each other, in the sort of chaos that ensues, the Muslims, the Arab armies come out of Arabia and start spreading north into the Levant, across North Africa into Egypt and to the Caucasus, ultimately going on to Central Asia. Now, in Georgia, this translates into them moving north and basically controlling most of Georgia, with the exception of some areas which are sort of under sort of Byzantine influence. However, this doesn't last. And so what you have is particularly the Abbasids. So the Abbasid Empire sort of has problems administering their empire, becomes very large. And what you start to see in sort of the 10th century is you start to see that the Abbasid, and late 9th centuries, you start to see the Abbasid Empire starts to lose its grip on various regions. This includes Armenia as well. And Georgia starts to have the rise of various kingdoms who are ruling themselves, as well as the Emirate of Tbilisi, which is an Arab state centered around what is now, which is the modern state of modern city of Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. So what then happens is that you have the kings who are in Abkhazia, and they start expanding outwards and start forming what is known as the United Kingdom of Georgia, starting in 1008. But what you can see here is it's still pretty broken up, right? So there's still a lot of many little people ruled by various and assorted individuals. So when we're talking about the United Kingdom, we don't mean the entire area of what is now Georgia, merely that they're starting to conquer and consolidate. Now, this was not entirely straightforward because, of course, as they're trying to move, other people like the Byzantines and the Seljuk Turks start coming out, and so this area becomes this huge sort of area of conflict. And what we see is then at the end of the 11th, beginning of the 12th century, the king David the Builder, David the Fourth, is able to basically go from this, which, as you can see, is a lot of different little sort of principalities, to this, which is a fairly, as you can see, united and large kingdom. And David the Builder is one of the best known Georgian kings. He's considered the founder of what's known as the Georgian Golden Age, which is basically this huge period of literary output, artistic output. Georgia is a united kingdom. They're also moving southwards, as you saw in that map, ruling areas like Armenia. And so David is really sort of seen as being one of the greatest, if not the greatest, kings of Georgia. And we can see him here on the far right in this mural. Here's his handwriting. So if you want to see what that looks like, here it is. He's very sloppy, right? So if you look above, you can see how nice the writing is here. But yeah, he's the king, right? He doesn't have to have nice handwriting. And he also does things like where he has himself depicted as a Byzantine emperor. He's very much trying to establish himself in that light. So he's very much looking to Byzantium as being the sort of the inspiration and the thing that he wants to be. So essentially, he wants to be the next Constantine. He wants to found a new Jerusalem, a new Constantinople. So how does he do that? He founds a number of sites, but really the sort of most famous place is Galati Monastery, which we visited again during the trip. And so Galati Monastery, which is just outside of Kutaisi in Western Georgia, is really this amazing place. It's UNESCO World Heritage Site. Which basically, as he said, he wanted to found a second Jerusalem, a new Athens, better than the model of all ecclesiastical splendor. So really the whole point is to be as impressive as possible and look Byzantine, essentially. So sort of saying, he's the heir to the sort of the Christian empire. And this is actually very significant because in this period, the Byzantines are suffering horrendous losses against the Seljuks with the Battle of Manzikert and so forth. So that really what you can see is that he's really saying, I'm the real heir to all of this. I'm the person who is going to lead you forth. All come follow me. And he definitely had pretensions of continuing to expand his empire out. So in Galati Monastery, you have the main church with the narthex. And it's very much supposed to look similar to things from Constantinople, which of course is now in Istanbul. So the Mangana Monastery, built in the middle of the 11th century, which is now destroyed, and the Pantocrator Monastery, which still exists, which was built at the beginning of the 12th century. So he's very much looking to Byzantine models when he's trying to build his church. And the church is covered with wall paintings. And this is a thing that you'll see if you look at churches in Georgia, if you visit churches in Georgia, as we did, the churches are absolutely covered with the most amazing wall paintings. It is incredible. There are, for this talk, I actually had to cut out a bunch of stuff because if I just indulged my wall painting love, it would have been all that. So that's one of the things that was really great to actually see these. And so the mosaic and some of the wall paintings, which we'll see shortly, were added in the 12th century, but then the church continued to be added to through time with all kinds of wall paintings and things like that, which we'll see shortly. So first we'll look at some of the original wall paintings. So most of the wall paintings in the church are not original, but the ones that are the wall paintings in the narthex. Now the narthex is a very interesting part of the building. So it's not part of the main church. It's basically this liminal zone, basically people who couldn't go into the main church because some people weren't allowed into the main church had to worship in the narthex. This is also where they performed baptisms, other things like that. So this is this sort of area that if you're not allowed in, you can still go into and sort of participate and hear what's going on in the church, but not be completely a part of it. And part of what he had put into this narthex were showing the 7 ecumenical councils. So Georgia is an Orthodox country. So basically it's in communion with Greek Orthodoxy, in contrast to the Armenians, who are Monophysites. And this is all very complicated, so we won't get into it. But basically the church councils were determining some of these questions and some of these issues. Basically in these paintings, what he wanted to show was the king or the emperor, whoever that was, in looking very large, with the sort of bishops around it looking much smaller. David the builder himself held a number of councils. He tried to bring the Armenians into line with Georgian Orthodoxy. That didn't work, but he actually held his own councils as well. So he clearly, again, had this idea that he's the next Byzantine emperor. He's holding church councils. He's trying to implement orthodoxy, even though that didn't really work. So the paintings are not in the best of condition. As you can see, they've suffered badly from damp, but they've been restored. So you get a sense of the colors and the kinds of things. And you can see the various emperors, they're all helpfully labeled, which is very useful. Because then you know who is who, because as you can see, it all kind of looks the same. All the councils run together, which I sympathize with when I'm trying to remember which one is which. But basically, you can see the various emperors here looking much bigger than the bishops and archbishops again, and patriarchs again, to emphasize the importance of the ruler. So David's making very definite statements here. He's making sure he's putting this in the narthex. You have to go through this to get into the main church, so you would have seen this. And we know from information from the Pantocrator monastery that lighting in the narthex was very important, and they too actually talk about this. So they basically also have ecumenical councils in the narthex, and they talk about how you should light them, how you should use certain kind of lamps, how many lights you should have, should you illuminate it at night. So there's a lot of very complicated rules that we tend not to think of when we think of churches, that there would have been all these issues about lamps and lighting, and in order to illuminate or not illuminate parts of the paintings or not. So if we then move into the church itself, the first thing that strikes you when you go in is the mosaic. Now, mosaics in Georgia are unusual. You tend not to see them. This is much more of a Byzantine thing. Again, pointing back to David the Builder's attempts to link himself to Byzantium. And you can see here all of these different wall paintings. So these are from different periods post the actual building of the church. So the whole area is, as you see, just covered. And the other thing that's important to remember is because Georgia is a Christian country, these churches are living buildings. They're still in use, right? So they're still being used. They're still actually buildings that they're not just museums. I mean, they are that, but they're also buildings that people worship in and people actually use on a daily basis. And just to give you a sense of the music that we had, so David the Builder also composed hymns. And I wanted to give you a sense of Georgian chant, because Georgian chant is very unique. It's really amazing. I should apologize before we start for the bad video. This has to do with the way Zoom is, but mostly I wanted you to hear the music. So let's see if we can get this to actually work. Right. So that's to sort of give you a sense of what Georgian chant sounds like, which, as I say, is very unique. I've had the opportunity to actually hear it in person. It's really amazing. but also the fact that the king himself is composing hymns. So now if we jump forward slightly to Queen Tamar, also considered one of the greatest rulers in Georgia, one of the most beloved rulers of Georgia. Queen Tamar is really the sort of the person who rules right as Georgia is at its apex before the Mongols show up. Now, of course, everybody knows what happens when the Mongols show up. It doesn't go well, right? So, but this is really the last point where the Georgian Golden Age is really at its height. As you can see, Georgia is controlling a huge region. They also have a sphere of influence, which is also very large. So Georgia is doing super well. And then the Mongols show up and spoil the party, as they have a tendency to do. So here's Queen Tamar. And, you know, it's also interesting because, of course, she's a queen, and she's an extremely capable queen. And, you know, really, as I say, is one of the sort of the most beloved Georgian rulers. And here she is in Battania. Here's her coins. And you can see, again, her handwriting. So I always think it's really interesting when we see people's handwriting now. And it's with one of her husbands. They're both signing here. Now, as one part of the trip, both trips, we went to the site of Vardsia, which is again located in the south of the country. And this is this really unique sort of cave site built into the cliff face. It's quite exciting to walk around here. There's you could really hurt yourself if you got too close to the edge, or you didn't hold on to the bars that are about. So it's one of these things where, you know, one shouldn't be brave and attempt to just walk around, because basically the volcanic rock becomes extremely slick under people's feet, and you have a tendency to sort of, you know, have your feet fall out from underneath you. Fortunately, nobody that we ever saw actually did anything to themselves, but I'm sure that you could. So basically built into this rock are a series of churches and other things. And of course, this was an area where you could take refuge, right? So as you can see, it's highly defensible, right? So obviously it's extremely convenient if things are not going so well, that you can actually hide out in this area. And the cliff continues to erode, so you can actually see how that's happened here with one of the church walls, where actually the ceiling has actually fallen away, and part of the church has fallen over the side. So it's quite interesting in that sense. But again, there's lots of wall paintings, including of Queen Tamar, as you can see here. But as you can see outwards, you have this railing here. If you didn't have that, that would be extremely, should we say, treacherous. So finally, we're going to end with Svaneti, which I think is one of the most, well, it's hard to pick, right? But one of the most interesting areas in Georgia to visit. So it's a bit difficult to get to, but no longer reached on what was referred to as one of the world's most dangerous roads. So they have a new road now, but so it's easier to get to than it was, but it takes a long time by car. So basically, Svaneti is in this very mountainous area. When we saw the pictures when we started, and it's best known for its incredible tower houses. And so these are houses which seem to have had a defensive, basically defensive sort of function. And most of these people don't live in them anymore, as you might imagine, but it's very popular for backpackers and tourists to come and sort of walk around in the villages of Svaneti and walk between these areas. Now, I didn't do any hiking when we were there, but that's certainly something that people do a lot of, because as you can see, you have the Greater Caucasus Mountains here, and, you know, absolutely spectacular views. There's glaciers, there's all kinds of things. It's really incredible. And as you can see, all of these tower houses, and Svaneti, thanks to its sort of mountainous landscape, was always known as this place where people could go hide out, because it was hard to get there. And once you got there, it's hard to find people. So it's sort of traditionally been this area where people have gone to sort of seek refuge. And Svans, as we mentioned, they speak their own language within the Kartvelian language family, and have their own unique customs as well. And again, there's lots of churches with wall paintings, much smaller churches than the ones we looked at, but really sort of this unique area. And in the capital, Mestia, there's this really wonderful museum, the Svaneti Museum of History and Ethnography, which we went to, which has, is pretty much what it does, what it says. It has ethnographic material, it has icons, manuscripts, all sorts of things. And it's a really beautiful museum, and I think really gives a lot of information about Svaneti and, you know, all of this kind of, you know, what makes this area so unique and interesting. And then finally, we had some music already from David the Builder. I have music from Svaneti because their music is slightly different. Again, excuse the video. Not only is this video a bit choppy, it's also extremely old. As you see, it's from 1991. So it wasn't really in the best of condition anyway, but I wanted you to hear it. Right, so it gives you a sense of how different that sounds. I think you can even tell that by listening to the two next to each other. So very unique, very different. There's a lot of questions about Svan music. I'm not a Svan music expert, but I understand that has to do with the persistence potentially of older forms of archaisms, this kind of thing, as well as in the Svan Christianity as well. So just to end now, as I say, Georgia is this really amazing country with all these amazing things from all kinds of periods that you could ever want. There's music, there's, as you see, beautiful things to look at, really interesting history. There's wine, there's this unique language, this unique culture. So it's really was a privilege to go there with the OI, and, you know, hopefully at some point we can go back.
For over 100 years, the OI has been a leading research center for the study of ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. Join us in uncovering the past and learn about the beginnings of our lives as humans together. Become a member by visiting oi.uchicago.edu/member.